I formally welcome you, Mr. Ganesh Ojha, with a very warm good afternoon. This afternoon, my dear friends, I propose to deliberate and rummage the understanding regarding climate change and its relationship with human rights. Dear friend, in this context today, I intend to deliberate the relationship between climate change and human rights, the general framework of climate change and human rights, human rights implications of climate change, and what exactly has been the impact of global warming and environmental protection, human rights perspectives on climate change, human rights based approach to climate change, and progressive recognition of human rights obligations towards environment and climate change. We have to rummage further, my dear friends, the role of nation states, particularly in complying or ensuring their compliance with obligations, whether the obligations are substantive, whether the obligations are procedural, but these, compliance with regard to or in conformity with these, obligations, states compliance must be ensured. Further, we have to understand the limits and the potentialities of human rights protection system, implementation assessment, and at the same time, during assessing the implementation, impact, we must try to, cajole and further what we call, rummage the missing links between harmony and invention. Human rights misunderstandings, my dear friends, are there, and many geopolitical entities or nation states are reluctant, and this is something we have already witnessed during the Trump administration in United States of America. What kind of a cynical role the former president has adopted towards climate change. But at the same time, it is equally important that we must ensure the human rights mainstreaming in climate policy and climate justice. And this has also been put forward by many scholars as greening of human rights and combating climate change. At the same time, it is equally important, my dear friends, what exactly should be the future challenges. We have to identify the future challenges which pose existential threats on this beautiful planet. So there are certain important questions, my dear friends, and these questions gives us an understandable roadmap how to tackle this entire idea of climate change vis-a-vis human rights. Let me put at rest one thing in a very, very important perspective, that I am deliberating and delineating the idea of human rights exclusively in the context of climate change. I am not going to deal with the international climate change law, international climate law. That is not my intention, and that is not my brief so far this particular week is concerned. What is important is that we have to understand the impact of climate change on human rights, and to what extent the human rights framework could be utilized to ensure better what we call adaptation, resilience, and other important techniques which what we call maintains a balance between human rights and climate change. So therefore, the very first question that arises, that comes to our mind, is that how to put human rights at the center of climate change discourse. Therefore, we have to understand, my dear friends, has the time come to recognize the rights to healthy environment? That is another important, dimension that must also be taken care of. And what are the climate change and its multi-dimensional ramifications? What are the key rights central to human existence affected by the climate change? Do anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions affect human rights? Should fundamental rights shape climate policies, climate justice, and entire jurisprudence should be produced to understand that it is the primacy of human rights whenever any kind of a deforestation exercises, whenever any kind of industrialization exercise is undertaken, then it shall be the fundamental responsibility of all the stakeholders, as well as other important what we call policy makers, non-state actors, and state actors, or actors which have been sponsored and supported by the nation states and various what we call governmental agencies. So what exactly should be the framework, and where should we locate in this entire framework the primacy of human rights? So that is the most vital question, and that must also be attended. Is there any relationship between United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, that is popularly known as the UNFCCC? This is something you have already studied in your international environmental law classes, but my intention is not to visit international environmental law, and there should not be any kind of overlapping. What is my intention is that we have to confine exclusively, my dear friends, to this particular understanding of human rights. What is the relationship between human rights framework and climate change, and to what extent the climate change has basically deteriorating and jeopardizing the entire what we call accessibility to human rights and enjoyment of human rights in a given situation. Therefore, how to explore the relationship between climate change and interdependent human rights through the lens of an international and comparative perspective? Is there any possibility of overcoming the divide between universal rights and climate change? That has to be what we call answered. This is something which constitute a very, very important what we call asseverations, a very important framework in our debate. Another important question that is also there: what exactly are the opportunities and challenges for human rights advocacy surrounding climate change, and why is the inter-American human rights system or the European system of human rights perceive this idea of or impact of the climate change? Why the climate change has not been appropriately what we call addressed at the regional human rights what we call conventions? That must also be taken care of. So how to understand this entire what we call pragmatism that has been given in various institutional frameworks? So therefore, in my understanding, my dear friends, there is a need for a human rights agenda within the framework of shared human security. There is a requirement of HRBA approach, that is the human rights based approach, and we should try to what we call reframe the entire what we call human rights based approach in addressing the consequences, impacts, influences of climate change. Because it has been, there has been some kind of a scholarship. There has been an emerging scholarship which is basically indulging in the climate change lawfare. So therefore, climate change poses unprecedented challenges, and no one knows how suitable a planet 3 or 4 degrees warmer on average will be for human life. So that has to be taken into consideration. And what we do know is that the climate impact or climate change impacts are already changing socio-ecological the systems, and will ultimately lead to profound what we call challenges, as well as conflicts over the natural resources. That has become a bone of contention, and because of these conflicts, many geopolitical entity has been embracing and has been what we call, or have been confronting various what we call I mean, menaces as well as the, negative impact of the globalization. Because all you understand, one of the, pervading line of argument regarding globalization is that it goes beyond the, integration of the national economy with that of the, internationally recognized economic order. And pervading line and very surreptitious line of argument is that it goes beyond this kind of a, economic integration, and it is basically based on the neo-imperialism, and it is encapsulating and conquering the national economies for the, appropriation, exploitation of world economies. So that should also be taken into considerations, because it is very important. And that here lies, my dear friends, the basic and the most fundamental requirement how to frame climate change, and how to what we call, put entire, climate change or climate change framework within the socket of international human rights law, human security perspective. So this is how we should what we call, try to understand, because climate change has now become the defining issue of the contemporary circumstances, and one of the biggest, threats to humanity and human security. Therefore, it is very, very important, my dear friends, even if you take the recent Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is popularly known as the IPCC, you might have studied, and you might have also studied various reports, which has ultimately what we call, proven to be or presented a reality check, making it clear that the climate change is already affecting the world by laying out its various manifestations, including temperature increase, sea level rise, and other important what we call, changes in the rainfall, what we call, patterns. So this is very important, and how these, developments have been affecting the, enjoyment of human rights in various parts of the world, and South Asia is not free from the cascading impact which we have been, embracing, which we have been confronting with so far the, climate change is concerned, and its, adverse impacts are, concerned in our part of the world. So if you take into account, there is another important, side to it. And the side is, my dear friends, we have been, witnessing a new kind of a landscape of, a new kind of a, proscenium, a new kind of a, stage, a new kind of a, canvas, a canvas of climate diplomacy. What do we mean by, climate diplomacy? I basically perceive in my individual capacity, my dear friends, the idea of, climate diplomacy is, and recently, right, just now we have also, witnessed in the COP27 at Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, that how the priorities of developed economies, national interest, so-called national interest of highly industrialized economies, development agenda that has been spearheaded and piloted by the Bretton Woods institutions under the garb of the welfare of the developing economies. How Indonesia yesterday and day before yesterday was, ultimately convinced, though there has been a political reluctance on the part of, Indonesia during the climate negotiations at Bali. What we have been, witnessing, that the fossil fuel based, particularly, coal industry, because energy has become one of the most important sought after resource. And without energy, it has become difficult to survive or to have a dignified existence of the nation states. And that is also a challenge before Indonesia, since it is hosting this, it has been hosting the G20, what we call, conference. Egypt has also, voiced the similar what we call, concerns. So climate change has become central to the human rights advocacy, and therefore it has become necessary to pursue, and the nation states have also, pursuing this idea of, diplomacy of preventing dangerous climate change. But they are forgetting, my dear friends, one thing, that the highly industrialized nation states are still, talking and advocating about their self-interest and the primacy thereof. They are not ready to budge from their national goals, and they are indulging in some kind of a, arm twisting. Because on the sidelines of any kind of an international summit or international conference on, climate change, the decisions are, taken at the, ministerial level or at the diplomats level, and lot of, arm twisting is also, ensured. And this is how the decisions are generally taken and presented in a euphemistic, what we call, semantical appropriation at the, summit level. So that has, created a new kind of a, canvas, a new kind of a landscape, which is known as the climate diplomacy. But in climate diplomacy, it is the, global South nation states who are, losing a lot. Because when we are, talking of climate diplomacy, and it is, axiomatic from various analytical, what we call, understandings and studies, that limiting climate change, so far the climate change risk level is concerned, then though it is perceived as the most, catastrophic and irreversible changes to the entire, what we call, or in the entire, climate system, but it would still result in significant economic and social cost in all parts of the world. And it is the, developing economies who finds themselves, or who find themselves at the receiving end. Therefore, under the United Nations framework, convention on climate change, my dear friends, parties have also agreed to review the adequacy of the 2-degree, what we call, Celsius target. But how? If you see, particularly in the post-2015 scenario, what has been the response of the highly industrialized economies, that creates a very grim picture. That creates some kind of a, vulnerable picture. The entire responsibility cannot lie with the developing nation states. So therefore, the climate diplomacy should not be a one-sided pervading line of argument. Climate diplomacy demands that there should be some kind of a policy of the quid pro quo, and exclusively based on the human rights approach, or human rights based approach, what we call it in abbreviation as HRBA. So this is very, very important, my dear friends, and it should be the responsibility of the community of, nation states. They must have some kind of an, assessment so far their climate change journey is concerned. Because the United Nations, framework, my dear friends, if you take into account the United Nations human rights based approach to climate change, then United Nations perceives, and United Nations have also what we call, introduced, I should say, a human dimension to international climate law. If you revisit, my dear friends, an article that was published in 2009 by the office of the, High Commissioner for Human Rights in a form of a, report, then this report has established and acknowledged and recognized the relationship of climate change and human rights, and it has undertaken, my dear friends, to develop the United Nations human rights based approach to climate change into a more meaningful conceptual framework. My dear friends, human rights also provide an accountability framework for damages related to climate change. Once the conceptual link of human rights law and global warming is established, accepted, recognized, acknowledged. So that is the understanding. So at all level of our understanding, we find that there is a relationship, and on many occasions, at regional level, at national level, at international level, this kind of a conceptual framework has envisioned and contemplated that there should be a UN HRBA to climate change. And that is why, and the basic and the most fundamental idea of the United Nations sponsored HRBA is to what we call rummage and establish the human dimension to international climate law. So in this connection, it becomes very, very important, my dear friends, that we should concentrate on these particular aspects. Although approaches to enhance the concept remain fragmented in many of the geopolitical entities, in many of the what we call, magnum opus that has been produced by the perennial higher education, scholarship. And it is generally argued, my dear friends, by many of the scholars that a human rights-based approach can have a significant impact on the international climate change discourse. And at the same time, it provides access to institutions for the concretization of the state obligations and introduces subjective, substantive, and processual rights, and thus it creates, my dear friends, a vertical dimension to international climate law, and that vertical dimension is exclusively what we call, sheltered, clothed, and accepted in the entire what we call, umbrella, and that umbrella is, formed of treaty obligations, you may call it, or the core 9 international human rights treaties and the obligations which have been envisioned thereunder. So it is very important. This is how we should try to understand the entire discourse so far climate change and human rights are concerned. So therefore it has become necessary, my dear friends, if you take into account this perspective, and I think I have been able to agitate you intellectually, conceptually, to understand what is the relationship between climate change and what we call human rights. Any questions? Well, adequately responding climate change or attending climate change menace is one of today's major challenges. And it has become a well-established factor, particularly for the international community of nation states. Because if you take into account the strategies to limit human-induced global warming, as well as adapt to the consequences of the global climate change requirement, and one of the most important requirements that comes to my mind is that it is a requirement which is known as international cooperation. It is a requirement which is based on international coordinates regarding development agenda. It is an international requirement under the international climate law that it cannot operate. It should not be allowed to operate. It must have an implementation, assessment, enforcement framework. And that framework must be what we call, formed of fundamental human requirements or human dimensional, understandings, which may be taken from the 9 core international human rights treaties. Therefore, my dear friends, we can say that international climate regime, international climate law, international what we call understandings presents itself a highly specialized area of international law. So climate change has come to stay. It has already established its what we call, credibility, as well as what we call, as a legal regime, as an international issue, as a global issue, and it has become the part of international diplomacy. It has become the part of the international relations. It has become the part of international law. It has become the part of multilateralism discourse in the arena of what we call of international global affairs. So everywhere we find that there is what we call a presence of climate change, and it has become the biggest global what we call issue, along with what we call human exodus, in the form of refugees, in the form of asylum seekers, in the form of statelessness, in the form of what we call migration, in the form of immigration, in the form of disaster induced human displacement and environmental relocation. So if you take into account, my dear friends, that there are two important narratives to understand climate change, because the climate change has been resulting into two important categorizations. One is the human displacement, and another one is the human relocation or human migration, or climate change induced human migration, or climate change migration. So these are the two important features. Climate change has also been, and that is why we are talking of, because of military interventions, because of developmental agenda or developmental interventions, or in the name of progress, we have been addressing the sanctity, integrity of climate, what we call or climate, or preventing climate change. Humanitarian displacement of humanity. When we are using humanitarian, it means I am talking of the violence and conflicts or armed conflicts. War and a non-conflict, armed conflict has also established that there is a human migration and war. An armed conflict has also casting very, very malicious and pernicious impact on climate, and that is why climate change is there. That is one of the most important factors, and this is something we are mature enough to understand the environmental cost of the conflict which is going on between Ukraine and Russian Federation, and that is why today we are talking of the rights of nature. Another important factor which is responsible for climate change is the environmental degradation, industrialization, deforestation, military interventions, landmines, reckless development or lopsided agenda for the development, how the natural ecosystems are going to be what we call redirected, reshaped, and rediverted, how the natural course of streams of many of the rivers are being changed. So a lot of factors are responsible for, and these developments are ultimately resulted in the casualty of human rights. Because under all circumstances, it is the primacy of human rights that must be sanctified. If we protect human rights, and that is why in this particular engagement, it is the primacy of the human rights, and that should also be taken as a framework to revisit the entire canvas of climate change. If we are protecting human rights, my dear friends, because this was the argument yesterday at the Bali process, at the Bali, what you call, summit, and the minister in the Bududo, what you call, government, he was of the view who made a statement, and I was, listening that very statement yesterday. He made this statement that if we abandon, coal industry, we understand that we are creating lot of problems. He admitted it. Problems are there for the climate, and it is, affecting climate change or carrying out climate change. But if we stop these, what we call, emissions, the carbon which we are, emitting, then there would be poverty. Even the, marine ecology is under attack. They are understanding each and everything, but they don't want any kind of a, starvation, hunger, or any kind of a, poverty. That was the, argument. So how to compensate, my dear friends? Should a right to compensation? Should be, or should we, call for some kind of a, equity in the name of what we call of, development? If some nation states cannot be industrialized, then what is the alternative available to them? In terms of employment, in terms of, employability, then how to address these kinds of, situations? So homelessness, joblessness, poverty, starvation, how to address these, developments? Because there is a migration even in peacetime because of the, economic reasons. If you take into account, my dear friend, the employability that has been, provided by various geopolitical entities and their governments, then the picture is very, very dismal. I can give you an example, a latest example of the Bosnia-Herzegovina. After the disintegration of Yugoslavia, many nation states emerged. After the Dayton Agreement of 1995. But what we have been, witnessing for the last more than 2 years, that there is a what we call, migration to urban centers in Bosnia-Herzegovina, even from urban centers to foreign lands. Should we have this kind of a, model of, development? Yesterday, it has also been, recorded that 8 what we call, Arab population is there. And it was yesterday, my dear friends, when this figure was what we call, recorded. So at the same time, we are supposed to, rethink, reimagine the carrying capacity of the planet Earth. That is equally important. So in these, situations, what is the fate? What is the future of human rights? That is another important what we call, I mean, this is the, collateral issue. And how to attend this, my dear friends? It is definitely demands all kinds of what we call of, reimagination, revisualization, and recrafting the entire, international agenda. The 1992 United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, as I have already submitted, this regime has, complemented by the 1997 Kyoto Protocol. And it also acknowledges that change in the Earth's climate and its, negative what we call, impacts are a, global common concern. Or this is a single what we call, most important concern of the entire humankind. If you take into account, my dear friends, the first preambular, clause that, provides for a common international legal framework in order to stabilize greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at the level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. If you take into account Article 2 of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. It has been what we call, established. It is the mandate of Article 2. And in addition to this, my dear friends, these uniquely formulated treaty provisions, if you take into account, pre-existing rules of international law must also be what we call, invoked. For example, rules of international environmental or human rights law, as well as secondary rules with regard to the state responsibility. Because it is the state responsibility that, frames the legal context of regulation. Hello? Yes, Miss Shaira Tasneem. Are you saying something? Well, dear friends, identification of pertinent, relevant, and contextualized international rules, as well as the determination of the scope of their applicability in the context of climate change, that needs a comprehensive interpretation process, and that should also be what we call governed by a variety of factors, particularly in the international law context. And the actors are nation states, international organizations, non-governmental organizations. And over the years, what we have been witnessing, my dear friends, the international what we call international jurisprudence and legal prolific writings and legal scholars' contributions. Therefore, in order to implement a human rights-based approach to climate change, it is very, very important, my dear friends, that the conceptual link of human rights and climate change goes back to an initiative that was undertaken again by a country located in South Asia, and that is Maldives, and which is popularly known as the Malé Declaration on the Human Dimension of the Global Climate Change. So the contributions which have been made, and you might have studied in your environmental law classes, my dear friends, the mandate of the Malé Declaration, how Malé Declaration addresses what kind of a note of caution this particular declaration takes into account. So it is on the basis of this understanding that we should try to develop entire what we call discourse, because the Malé Declaration, my dear friends, has primarily made certain important what we call requests, I should say, that the assessment of human rights implications of the global warming, particularly the Human Rights Council also adopted this particular approach, and it was reflected for the first time in the year, I think, 2008. Even this international body has also came out with a very, very important advocacy. And this international body has also invited that there should be some kind of a study on this particular issue. And the draft study was also conducted, and based on the written and the oral submissions of many of the geopolitical entities, nation states, international organizations, civil society organizations, civil society institutions, international institutions, scientific groups, expert groups, and other important stakeholders, they came out with the idea that there should be some kind of a understanding regarding the relationship between climate change and human rights. And subsequently, my dear friends, this particular report, this study, draft study, was published in, I think, in 2009. Yes, somebody is speaking something, wants to say something.
Sir, what's the name of the organization?
Which organization?
The organization that is conducting studies on this.
Well, the draft study was conducted under the auspices of the Office of the United Nations Commissioner for Human Rights in 2008. And it was the report that was subsequently submitted in 2009. It has been published. That report remains in the public domain. So if you want that very report, then I would like to share it. I will email you. Do you want this report?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I will share. Just please drop me an email. I always request that the email should be there, because that keeps me reminding that I am having this agenda for a particular day. So I have to fulfill that very obligation. Please drop an email to me and I will come out with the report, the draft report. And to what extent this particular report has been appreciated by many of the geopolitical entities. Anyway, even this report was also subsequently presented before the United Nations Human Rights Council. And they have also what we call, critically appreciated this very report. And ultimately, they came out and acknowledged, and they also demanded there should be further what we call, debate, discussions, and deliberations on this report. And it was also, submitted for the perusal and scrutiny of the various nation states, particularly the coastal states, who are basically facing and confronting the rising sea level. So that should also be, taken care of. So there are many, this report constitutes, and many, you can also, write and submit even research papers. So that research, your potential research papers on this particular, aspect, how to make human rights central to the entire, climate change regime, then definitely it is going to what we call, constitute a very, very important, contribution. So this is very important, my dear friends. And another important, dimension that I wish to what we call, deliberate on this particular, aspect is basically on the question of what we call, question of, narratives, key research narratives. If you take into account the narratives of, climate change, then these narratives, my dear friends, are becoming central to the development discourse. And increasingly, I should say, the framing understandings of other global, challenges such as poverty and health, because health is another important, dimension. If you take into account these new climate change narratives, then these climate change narratives have been affecting existing what we call, approaches and responses to the poor and their rights, particularly as regards their social rights related to resources profoundly affected by climate change impacts such as water and food. And there are many other important, rights. Then these key research narratives, my dear friends, try to rummage, try to cajole general problems of climate change. And on the basis of these general problems of climate change, a cultural approach to human rights is also emerging as a new research narrative. Then there is another important dimension to it, and that is the culture. In addition to the cultural approach, the current status of human rights in the entire schematization of international climate law or climate change law. Then the climate change and human rights, what kind of a, as a synthesis, as an amalgamation, what exactly are the challenges which comes out of this particular, hobnobbing? Then what are the key challenges for a human rights based approach to climate change, and what are the current what we call questions which are being debated? So when we are talking of general problems, my dear friends, then the general problems need to develop a complex understanding of human rights. And this complex understanding of human rights must be located in the current geopolitical context, which must also try to incorporate the role of the local actors, as I have already mentioned. I mean, some kind of parallel systems are also the need of the hour. When I am talking of the parallel system in the arena of climate change vis-a-vis human rights, then I can give you an example, and this example I have already shared, that the parallel systems of governance, so far the climate change regime is concerned, then we must have, my dear friends, the groupings like G20, which is going on. And this is my humble submission to all of you, that you must make yourself aware with the outcome of the G20 at Bali. What kind of a program agenda, I mean the program of action that is likely to emerge over there, that must also be the part of your what you call study. So this is my submission, while understanding what is going to be the result of the G20 deliberations at Bali. So the parallel system must also be promoted. And another important dimension that comes to my mind is, my dear friends, that we should try to understand that we are talking of the limits of juridification, I call it. I'm not using the word jurisdiction. Rather, the jurisdiction has been or have been what we call juridified. So we should try to contemplate what kind of what we call limitations should be there when we are talking of in the transnational perspective, in international perspective, in the context of what we call of local perspective. So we try to understand we must have some kind of a limits of juridification. Because you have studied as a student, and this is my presumption, my dear friends, you can correct me, you might have studied another important decision, and this is a very, very famous what we call decision, Trail-Ismailter what we call decision on the transnational harm. So we have to understand this dimension of what we call of human rights. Another important narrative which I was talking was the cultural approach to human rights in the context of climate change. So when we are talking of a cultural approach to human rights, my dear friends, then the importance of the local actors, local stakeholders, local experts and local scholarship and local administrators becomes very, very important. Because human rights in the global south, from the green revolution to the rights of what we call revolution, is of vital importance, and that constitutes a very, very important stage. Because it is a journey, my dear friends, that must be appreciated in the perspective of the rights discourse. And that is why today in the global south we have been talking of the rights of nature. So we can say that we are basically having some kind of a vernacularization of human rights at the local level. Or you may call it the globalization of human rights at the local level, or localization of the global human rights at the lowest level. Whatever may be the nomenclature, but what is important is that under all circumstances, we should try to adopt and take into account the local aspirations, local dreams, and local concerns. And that is why Kishan Ganga decision, Vedanta decision, and other decisions in the context of what we call of the rights of nature becomes very much more relevant, and many other important decisions which have been handed down by the Supreme Court of Pakistan as well, Supreme Court of New Zealand, Supreme Court of what we call Ecuador. Even the Article 8 of the Constitution of Ecuador also emphasize this particular line of inquiry. Another important narrative that comes to my mind is the current state of human rights in the context of what we call of climate change. My dear friends, this reminds me of a very, very important statement that was delivered in the year, I think, 2000 by Kofi Annan. Kofi Annan has branded the 21st century as a century of human rights, particularly in the context, because each and every discipline, my dear friends, are taking into consideration certain important, aspects, and these aspects constitute a very, very important dimension. Because in the area of international climate change law, in the area of some other, specializations, in some other, fragmentation, intellectual fragmentation, in the area of international human rights law, in the area of international constitutional law, or some other, specializations, what we have been, witnessing, the scholarship, specific scholarship in different areas, have been what we call, crowning, recrowning, and recrafting their, dedication, and they are dedicating on the basis of their specialization that this is a century which should be attributed to this particular aspect. So therefore, the Kofi Annan has also, taken the same line of argument, and he came out with the idea that this entire, century, and this is a statement which he has, made in 2000, year 2000, and he came out with this, understanding that the 21st century is going to be a century of human rights, and he described it or crowned it as an age of human rights. Because if we are, talking of human rights, then in the post 9/11 scenario, how the same argument was, converted into a different kind of a, nomenclature. Because on September 11 in 2001, it was the turning point in the history of, human rights that impacted the entire human rights peregrination. Because if you take into account, or since the inauguration of the United Nations organization in 1945, or particularly in the later half of the 20th century, my dear friends, what kind of a, visualization and visibility was accorded to the primacy and emergence of human rights, that is an open secret. All of us understand that it was the period, the later half of the 20th century was the period that constituted and that has acknowledged the persons of human beings as a subject matter of international law. But there has been, a very, very vital development in the form of the 9/11. And a project, the Western project, Americanized, project was started, which is known as the War on Terror. So in this particular, phase, we have witnessed the emergence of a new kind of a concept, my dear friends, and that is known as per my own understanding, the rise of the global security state. So the 21st century, even still, we have been, grappling with this kind of a, narrative, the global security state narrative. It was, basically presented by the two administrations, of United States of America. And that was, my dear friends, War on Terror project. Even Guantanamo Bay detention facility, Abu Ghraib, these developments has ultimately established the elimination and the, destruction of the liberal utopia. And that, destruction and decimation has started in the year 2003. And that is still what we call, continuing. That we are also having some kind of a collateral development, my dear friends, and that development reminds me of the emergence of the China as an, authoritarian capitalist powerhouse that has, that ultimately gobbled up, that has become some kind of a guzzler. It has, guzzled up, it has, swallowed almost what we call, 11% of the GDP growth, particularly between what we call, first decade of the 21st century, that it starts from, 2001 and goes up to 2010. So another important, development has also taken place, and this development has also cast some kind of a, impact on the course of, climate change history, and that is from Arab Spring to the Arab, winter. It's some kind of a, we have, witnessed during this particular what we call, period, some kind of a, apoplectic death, what we call, cults. Migrant crisis has also emerged, my dear friends, during this particular, period in Europe. Refugee crisis, which is popularly known as the refugee crisis of Europe or refugee crisis in Europe. So violence has also what we call contributed a lot in the entire what we call, ecosystem or the ecology of the environmental stability. So many other important, developments have, taken place even during this particular period, my dear friends. We have also witnessed a return of what we call of ethno-nationalism in Europe, and that ultimately paved the way for Brexit. So you can very well understand these, developments, and that is why, my dear friends, climate change, not only in the global north, what we call, region, or the global north jurisdictions, has been, affected by, terror groups, radicalized, groups, war, and ongoing war. We are also witnessing what kind of a, the casualties have been there, how the ecosystem is being, damaged by the Russian armed, forces in Ukraine. And we have also, witnessed the similar kind of what we call, war tactics in our part of the world, and that is the, global south. And that is why Rashida B, an impactee of, Union Carbide Corporation tragedy in India, she has rightly what we call, acknowledged that we are not what we call, expendable. We are not what we call, flowers. And to be what we call, offered at the altar of, profit and power. So we are, dancing. We are dancing. Flames, continued to conquering, darkness. We are, challenging those who threatened, my dear friends, the survival of the planet and the magic and mystery of life. So these guys try to, understand the gravity of the, climate change, how industrial disasters, whether it is Bhopal in India, whether it is, Chernobyl in, Russian Federation, or in some other, republics, whether it is, Kainar region of what we call of, Kazakhstan, where the nuclear facilities have been, covered with an iron canopy, a huge one that has also what we call, required, and lot of upfront investment was, doled out for this, facility. How the nuclear, installations around the world, what kind of a, security and what is the, quality of life in and around those, nuclear installations. And nobody is, bothering about the denuclearization. So these developments have ultimately, my dear friends, affected climate change and human rights. So the climate change as a human right, my dear friends, must also be taken care of. Because when we are, deciding and determining that it is going to be the framework to resurrect, to restore, to retain the virginity of, climate, inviolability of, climate, sanctity of the climate, integrity of the climate, then the human rights framework becomes a methodology. It becomes a remedy to ensure sanctity of the, climate, and there should not be any kind of a, change. And that is why the subsequently after, Kofi Annan, even Ban Ki-moon has also what he called as the Secretary General of the United Nations organizations was worried about the, climate change. And he was of the view that basically the climate change threatens our, ability to achieve sustainable development. And in many cases, in several cases, our very own, survival happens to be in some kind of a jeopardy. So there is a complete, consensus at international level, my dear friends. But it is the, economic, lavishness, economic, avarice, I should, call it, that ultimately has become the, guiding force to discard the climate-related concerns of the community of nation states. And it is the, developing economies, it is the transforming economies, it is the, emerging democracies on the, on the other side of the, planet, and that is the global south. They happens to be at the receiving end, and they are, suffering a lot so far, climate change and its, treatment within the framework of what we call of, human existence or humanity. That is why, my dear friends, if you take into account the fifth assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that is very categorically confirmed that the climate change is real and human-made greenhouse gas emissions are its primary cause. Directly or indirectly, this kind of a, menace of climate change threatens the, full and effective enjoyment of a range of, human rights by people throughout the, world, including the right to life, right to water, right to sanitation, right to food, right to health, right to housing, right to self-determination, right to culture, and right to development. So number of, rights are involved. If you take into account another important what we call narrative in the, consideration, then the negative impact of the climate change are disproportionately borne by the persons and communities already in disadvantageous, situations, so owing to the, geography, poverty, gender, age, disability, cultural or ethnic, background, among many other important, factors that have historically contributed, the least to the greenhouse gas emissions. We are not responsible. Even we find, so far the impact of the climate change is concerned, we find an idea of the substantive equality. Whether I, in my individual capacity, as a Maldives, as a Bhutan, as a Afghanistan, I haven't, contributed, I haven't what we call, polluted this entire, climate or planet. Because we have been, ecologically independent and neutral, what we call, geopolitical entities. Even then, we happens to be at the receiving end. It means the crimes which have been committed by the developed, economies and the less developed economies or the transforming economies have become the victim of their crimes. So in such a situation, my dear friends, what I, contemplate that there should be some kind of a right to reparation, state responsibility to protect, and the major what we call, blame share should come in favor of these highly developed nation states. Many nation states on this beautiful planet do not have the adequate resources, adequate industrial wherewithal. They are not in a position to pollute. Even then they are suffering. Who is responsible for this kind of a, inequity? What is the legitimacy of this kind of a, development? How we have been, bringing many, the natural resources, whether it is the, Syrian war, whether it is the Afghan war, whether it is, Libyan war, whether it was the, Gulf war, whether it was, Vietnam war, whether it was Korean war. My dear friends, try to understand the economics of war. It is, wars are always, fought not for peace, but for economic leverage and economic exploitation. A war always fought for the economic resources of a particular geopolitical entity. War are always, fought for feeding the what we call, victors, to serve the interest of the, victors, to serve the, what we call, interest of the attackers, aggressors. In Afghanistan, it is full of, natural resources. Gulf is what we call, full of, very abundant, very opulently, rich in natural resources. So why? Why there is no war after, Second World War? They came out even, they have basically, if they wanted, they came out to see the, their policy. Even immediately after the conclusion of the, war, Second World War, they came out with the, regional convention that was subsequently have become a universal convention or an international, convention. They came out, the global, what we call, northern jurisdictions came out with a piece of what we call of, convention or regional convention, and that is the Refugee Convention, my dear friends. A Eurocentric document that did not bother at all. And that too under the auspices of the United Nations organization. So that is the reason I consider in my personal capacity, my dear friends, that United Nations organizations, or in the name of multilateralism or multilateral alignment or engagement, they are basically spearheading their own interest. And on this particular point, I immensely appreciate the argument that was proffered by the Foreign Minister of India, Dr. S. Jaishankar, that Europe should, come out. I'm quoting, I'm not able to what we call, come out with the, in verbatim, what exactly has been the, construction of language of our, foreign minister, but at least I can share the gist with you and try to what we call, perspective-wise this particular, understanding. Let me put it in the correct, perspective or contextualize with this, manners of climate change. What Europeans, I mean the European problems, and Europe should come out with this kind of a, box understanding. European problems should not be presented as global problems, and the global problems should not be presented as non-European problems. So they have, presented, global north has been presenting their what we call concerns, problems, everything as the global what we call, problem. And they are convincing very cogently, very euphemistically, that if climate change is, taking place in the United States of America, or there happens to be some kind of a what we call, I mean, melting is taking place at Antarctica, or there happens to be some kind of a, laying down of, sea cables. And during this entire process, they are basically tampering with the, ecology, marine ecology. It should not be presented as the, global problem. Because if you take into account the littoral problems or the climate change problems, which is being confronted by Bangladesh, by Maldives, by Indonesia, and many other what we call, or like, Malaysia, and there is a problem of the sea rise, then the Western world is not at all worried. And it is also further axiomatic from the unilateral declarations on the or unilateral actions on the part of the United States of America under the Trump administration. How it withdrew from Kyoto Protocol of 1997. How it has withdrew, I mean how it has withdrew from Paris Agreement of the 2015. How the entire nuclear deal between the P5s and Iran was ultimately put into dustbin. So these developments, my dear friends, are a collateral or having a collateral impact on climate change, because whenever the war industry is undertaken or war projects are undertaken, they present a credible menace to the ecology, environmental stability, and they also contribute in environmental degradation. They also contribute in climate change, and that results into the human migration, human relocation. And there are certain important rights of climate change refugees or the climate change migrants, which have not been properly articulated and recorded, incorporated in the textbooks, in the reference books on, climate rights. So this is very, very important. One such right that comes to my mind is a right to historical sense of belonging to a particular area. Nobody is taking into consideration these kinds of rights. I have also, collected as many as more than a dozen such rights, my dear friends. And I will share those very rights. And you will not find a single reference of those very rights in any of the reference books, in any of the, literature that I have been, sharing constantly with all of you. So there are, certain rights. Every right cannot be the part of some kind of a juris corpus. Every right cannot be written, because there are, certain important rights which can only be felt. These rights are abstract rights. These rights cannot be reduced into black and white. So if you take this entirety of rights understanding, then you will find that there are, certain important, negative rights, negative impacts, and which require, because people who have not contributed anything, they are also, suffering because of the, climate change, and they do not have any contribution in climate change. Therefore, Human Rights Council, my dear friends, in special, procedure mechanisms, and the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights continue to emphasize a human rights-based approach to climate change, and that should be the what we call, mandate. In addition to what I have, submitted, there are certain important essential attributions, essential attributes to human rights-based approach to climate change. My dear friends, climate change policies and programs are formulated. The main objective should be to fulfill human rights. Because whenever we are, talking of climate change policies and programs, then we generally, or the nation states generally bypass, or sometimes deliberately, or sometimes inadvertently, because they generally prefer and give primacy to the economic agenda instead of the human rights agenda. If at all we find some kind of a, commitment with that of the, preservation of human rights and promotion of human rights during climate, talks, we find only some kind of a, reference, some kind of a, inferential consequence we find in their, deliberations. But the rights holders and their entitlements must also be identified, which is generally not done, as well as the, corresponding duty bearers and their obligations, in order to find ways to strengthen the capacities of the rights holders to make claims, and of what we call of the duty bearers to meet their obligations. This must also be, crystallized, concretized, and placed. A framework should be, there. A collateral framework whenever climate talks are, there. The human rights commitment, convictions, and guarantees must also be, ensured. Principles and standards derived from international human rights law regimes, especially the, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, my dear friends, and the core universal human rights, treaties, and there are as many as 9 important core international human rights, treaties, should guide all climate change policies and programming in all phases of entire what we call, process. And therefore it becomes relevant, my dear friends. What I have, submitted for your consideration is that please maintain a tab whenever you are what we call, going to assess the outcome of the, Sharm el Sheikh, what we call, international climate change conference in the form of, COPs 27. So what are the key challenges? The key challenges for a human rights-based approach to climate change, my dear friends, must also be identified. Then only we are going to use this framework for what we call redressing the grievances, redressing the, menaces, addressing the challenges which emanated from climate change. Key challenges: lack of trust in global institutions. Trust deficit is there as a, key challenge. Cultural and religious, identitarianism and that has become hostile to scientific elites. People are not ready to listen, my dear friends. I mean the nation states, policy makers, experts, stakeholders, institution framers. They are posing a lot of what we call, problems, and they are having a very hostile, attitude, and they adopt a policy of my way is highway. So that kind of a, understanding is not going to function. Another important, challenge that comes to my mind is the human rights system and global capitalism not equal what we call, opponents. And at the same time, in climate talks, my dear friends, it is the role of the states that is basically creating problems for some kind of a desired action or determined action or agreed action at the summit level. It is another important challenge, as I have given you an example, how Trump administration unilaterally withdrew from the Kyoto Protocol of 1997. Then again, my dear friends, human rights as a tool is not at all clear, and that creates some kind of problems that there is what is a climate change issue, climate change problem, or the climate change oriented challenge. There is no clarity. It must also be what we call crystallized, and we should also take into account what kind of challenges have been presented by countries, highly industrialized nation states like United States of America, like People's Republic of China, like Germany, like UK, United Kingdom. What kind of percentage of pollution which ultimately resulting in the climate change these nation states have been contributing. And it is basically, my dear friends, it's too little and too late kind of approach must be what we call dispensed with. But in my capacity, something is there in the chat box at this stage. I must invite Mr. Maharajan. Yeah. Mr. Maharajan has posed a question. How do you see, he's addressing me, how do you see atrocity induced human rights violation? Take South Asian University example. Can physical education be replaced by online education? Let me try. My response, Mr. Maharajan, should not be taken as a gospel truth. My response should not be taken as a final or some kind of a finality or intellectual finality. You have asked this question as a student of international human rights law. I am also going to respond to it as a student of international human rights law. Atrocity induced human rights violation. My dear friend, if I contextualize your question, then I am of the view atrocity is a very humongous kind of terminology. Atrocity in the context of international criminal law, atrocity in the context of international climate change law, atrocity in the context of penal laws of the land, atrocity in the context of human rights law. It basically explains that there has been some kind of a violent or violence oriented violations and transgressions of civil liberties. It should not be there, because atrocity in any form, physical, mental, psychological, intellectual, terror oriented, any kind of an atrocity constitute a punishable offense in the eyes of law. So therefore, I perceive atrocity in any form, whether it is susceptible to mental persecution, physical violence, torture, degrading treatment, ill treatment, all kinds of what we call of, violence should be prosecuted. So that is my understanding of atrocity induced human rights violation. Now you have further what we call, you have also contextualized your question. I have presented a wider what we call, connotation, but you have contextualized. Take SAU example. Can physical education be replaced by online education? My dear friends, this is a question which I would like to sensitize you about. I should sensitize you about your question. It is not a question of physical education. It is not a question of online education. It is a question, or your question, let me reframe it. It is a question, what are the different modes of education and benefits they are under? It should be something like this. You are free not to agree with me. You got every right to disagree with me, and I am here to honor your disagreement. Because this is the beauty of the intellectual liberty. We organize workshops. We organize offline workshops. We also organize online workshops. We organize symposium, online and offline both. We organize international conferences, seminars, colloquium, offline, online both. We also organize webinars, seminars, special lectures, lecture series, dedicated lectures, distinguished lectures, classroom lectures. We organize everything, and the basic fundamental purpose behind each and every event is to learn something, to educate something, to enlighten somebody. That is the basic and the most fundamental purpose. If you see the history of education, my dear friend, we started from the Guru Shishya Parampara. We started our journey. If I take a cue from the ancient India's education system, the education system that has been what we call recorded in Ramayana and Mahabharata, in our Vedas, in our what we call religious scriptures. So there has been an education system, my dear friend, and only it gradually what we call graduated to the modern level. So we started our education journey in ashrams, and our hermits and saints, sages have been our teachers. So if you ask this question in that very context, my dear friend, then we have reached from a stage to ashram to the hostel life, modern hostel life. So it is one of the what we call methods of education, manifestations of education, manifestations or modes of entitlement as well as enlightenment. So we are enlightening each other. This is not a question. This is not a question about the credibility of education. This is not a question about the efficacy of education. It is not the superiority or inferiority of a particular mode. I am not having, and you are not having adequate money to participate in a conference in London. So we are having a Zoom what we call method, or Google what we call Meet method. This technological advancement has provided and facilitated that we can connect. So in special what we call circumstances, we can handle. See the importance of if I take your argument in the area of law and order, if you take into account the involvement of the modern technological devices in the maintenance of law and order anywhere in the world or everywhere in the world, So see, now the law enforcement agencies are taking the help of what we call of the drones. Earlier, it was not there in my childhood. Drones were not there. Even if there was a report, if there happens to be any kind of a report, any information that in such and such locality, in such and such densely populated alleys, there happens to be some kind of a, rancor or some kind of a ruckus is, taking place, some pitched battles are being there or have been, there, then in such a situation, it was the physical persons that was required of the law enforcement, personnel. But this is not required. At least in advance, some kind of a, security measures could be taken or can be taken by the armed forces or by the, law enforcement agencies. So that does not dilute the importance of how to maintain law and order. So it is a question of, methods. It is not a question of, importance. You got complete freedom to put questions in the chat box. Had it been an offline what we call interactions, you would have asked. You could have, asked a direct what we call, question. Because in physical mode of, education, we maintain an eye contact, some kind of a, mental, psychological, and educational integration. But it is our, dedication and commitment in specific, situations, which does not require that we should, ponder over these questions, which mode of, education is better than the other. So that is my, submission. So now you can understand. If you require, I can further, elaborate. Second important, observations you have made in regard to scholarship issues and derivation of physical education in the second semester in the name of what we call of, campus shifting. And now they are trying to repeat the same in the fourth what we call, semester. So let the, fourth semester come, number one. Because these are, your questions are legitimate and correct. But to some extent, I am not the right person to attend your question because it is purely and purely of an, non-academic character. It is purely, though academics are involved, but it is purely and purely in the domain of administration. But let me try to respond to you. Scholarship issues and derivation of physical education. It is derivation or deprivation, Mr. Maharajan? Because I'm not able to understand the word derivation in this context.
Deprivation, sir. Deprivation.
Yes. Deprivation, yes. So scholarship issues and deprivation of physical education in the second semester in the name of campus, shifting. It was campus shifting happens to be an ancillary issue, my dear friend. It was primarily an issue of the global pandemic. Because the health is a very, very important aspect of our engagement, institutional engagement, collective engagement. And as a faculty collective, you are also included, my dear friends. As a faculty collective, it is our fundamental responsibility towards each other that we must maintain our, health, our physical, what we call, health, that constitute a very, very important element of our interactions. Even right now, if you take into account the global picture of, this, global pandemic that was created by coronavirus or the COVID-19, as it is officially known as. So even yesterday also in some parts of China has reimposed, lockdown. So even in my emails, I have added another word, waning COVID-19 global pandemic. Yes, it is waning, it is decreasing. The menace is, threat perception is lowering. But there is a, threat of this and we should be very alert. And we have to learn, my dear friends, how to survive with these kinds of, pandemics, epidemics, and other important, diseases. So we have to be alert at every moment, particularly in cosmopolitan cities like, Delhi, where another what we call, some kind of a, Even the pollution, quality of air is adding what we call salt to the injury. So we should not, forget. So your question about what we call, deprivation of physical education, it is not a deprivation. In my understanding, you got every right to disagree with me, and I'm going to honor that. Time and again, I have been saying this kind of a statement. So I approbate your line of argument, but within my own limitations, my dear friends, we are not practicing any kind in my individual capacity that there should be a physical deprivation of education. No, it has always been there. We have also suffered a lot. We do not like it is the classroom deliberations, which in my individual capacity I enjoy a lot, because I find a greater amount of satisfaction whenever the physical interaction, I mean in-person interaction, is taking place. But due to these kinds of ongoing circumstances in and around the campus, we have preferred this one. So we have taken with mutual what we call consent. So it is not a question of a deprivation. Another important issue which you have raised, that is, and so far second semester is concerned, I have already responded to it. And in the fourth what we call semester, there are no such plans that there would not be any kind of physical interaction. Yes, from January 11th we are going to have, as of now, whatever the understanding I have regarding the potential what we call while taking into consideration even the shifting part of the institution to its new campus, I am of the view physical interactions are going to be a reality in the next what we call semester, as you have mentioned, fourth semester. But another in regard to scholarship issues, my dear friend, scholarship issues, so far the scholarship allocation committee is concerned, it is scholarship committee. Let me clarify, as I have been told by the chair of the scholarship committee, I am simply a member. So scholarship committee does not have any mandate to formulate scholarship policy. It's a recommendatory body. And as on many occasions, as a special cases, we have made certain strong recommendations. Whenever there has been an application before the committee, only the favorable decision, favorable recommendation has been made. But we have to operate within the policy, and policies are framed at a higher body. So higher body is making policy, and the policy prescription is presented before the scholarship committee, and on the base in that very framework, we have to allocate, we have to note the determination, we allocate on the basis of that very scholarship policy. So that is the the mandate of this very committee. That is the understanding which I have received out of the observations and statement and whatever the documents were placed before the committee. So it should be amicably resolved. That is my hope, but I don't know what would happen. So these are my responses so far your query is concerned. If you are not satisfied, then you may further what we call pose specific questions to me. I will try to what we call address those very questions. Yes, Mr. Maharajan.
Sir, in my understanding, that is deprivation of physical education only, sir. Because I am the one who suffered because of that. Had it been physical education, I could have improved a lot than what I am now. Because I am writing email to the faculties since last December 2021 to give me a hostel, that I am very not good at communication. So that's why it really important for me. So in my understanding, it is deprivation only, sir.
Well, let me clarify. I respect that you have been writing,
Sir,
but
and
whenever
in the second semester, COVID was normal only in Delhi, and other universities in Delhi was open. So Yeah.
Brother, try to understand that we are not an Indian institution.
Yes, sir.
There are, diplomatic notes received from other, SAARC nation states regarding the reopening and restarting of the university. Everybody, and the consensus is the element to govern this institution. Consensus at the highest level of, governance. So it is not an, Indian institution, number one. If at all, it is being, funded extensively and hugely by the government of India. Yes, it is being. But at the same time, other stakeholders must also be consulted. So our, friends, I mean the students from Pakistan, students from Afghanistan, and some other, or to a very limited period, students from, Sri Lanka, they haven't been provided any kind of a visa. And still some students did not get a visa. So university is in the capacity of making requests to the respective governments, even to the government of India. I am not defending anybody. I am simply sharing the real picture. You can also be the part of this kind of a deliberation. You can also understand what kind of a communication so far has already taken place in this connection. So you can be privy to that particular. If you wish, you can visit the competent authority that what is the status of your communications regarding the visa issue. So the decisions have to be taken in its entirety. So we cannot have some kind of a piecemeal approach, that only one particular fragment of argument should be taken and that should become the bone of contention. No, that kind of a approach is not going to serve any kind of a purpose. And physical education, as you have pointed out, my dear friends, a physical education means in-person education you are talking of. Am I correct in my understanding?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Class at most.
So far, physical, you are not having any kind of an hostel accommodation right now?
Yes, sir. Now we have, sir.
So even my students, my research scholar made an application from Sri Lanka that I want to come to the campus and do my research work. So I need a recommendation letter. I provide a recommendation letter. Even then, almost 2-3 months were consumed. Then he was allowed in the hostel. So these are the administrative as well as the diplomatic hassles with these kinds of institutions, where we are going to, SAARC is a project which has been devoted to the management of contradictions and paradoxes. So everything is not hunky-dory. Everything is topsy-turvy in South Asia. So, but your concerns are legitimate. We should be more proactive. That I really appreciate. And we should, what we call, stride in that very direction. We should be proactively, but I see a lot of positivities after shifting from this building to a proper well-placed campus of the institution. Ms. Wasif has also made an observation, but can Indian government refuses to give visa from other SAARC nations? I have been told that Indian government is not issuing visas to 2021 and 2022 batch from Pakistan. I think I should keep mum, Miss Wasif. But when somebody happens to be in the business of speaking, he cannot be silent. Remain silent, and should not remain silent. I don't know anything about the refusal on the part of government of India. And at the same time, there is a noise. Let me put here. So if you am I audible to all of you?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. There is a lot of noise outside. I don't know what they are talking about, but I do not have, Ms. Wasif Rasool, any information about the refusal on the part of the government of India regarding the issuance of visa, number one. Number two, I don't know what is the, source of your information, because you have clearly written in chat box that you have been told that the Indian government is not issuing visas. So I do not find anything on a piece of paper on the part of the government of India. I do not, I haven't, come across with any of the, policy statement on the part of the government of India that it is not issuing or would not, issue any kind of a visa. Many governments around the world have not been very straightforward in issuing visas. Even from, South Asia, including what you call, different slabs of, time frame have been determined by various geopolitical entities like many European nation states, as well as, American, nation states like, United States of America, Canada. They have determined different kind of, slots so far issuance of a visa is concerned. So different, time frames have been, given. And on the basis of those very, time frames, people are getting visa. So I don't know what exactly is the, problem, what are the, issues which are, gripping this particular, request of, and university has made on many occasions a request to facilitate, to grant, to issue visa to our, students. And that is why this kind of a mode of, delivery of lecture was also, even initially, even university, when it reopened, it was reluctant even to accommodate or provide some kind of a, technological leverage to the students who did not get the, visa. But after, lot of, persuasions on the part of the, faculty collectives from different, departments, so from different, faculties, so ultimately we were, able to organize and provide you the, online class links. So that is the, scenario. But I hope, and I hope I'm not hoping against the, hope. So I see that visa should be granted. But I
Sir,
have
actually,
not.
I was asking this question. Okay, so Maya, you go ahead, please.
No, no, Wasav, you go ahead.
Yeah, please.
So I was asking this question because if I were a student of an other Indian university, then obviously this refusal I could understand. But
Yes.
being a part of international organization, I don't think that a government can refuse visa on the basis of its relations with another SAARC country. So that was my point. The twist here is that I am a part of international organization.
Yes. I completely understand your concern. And that is why it should be raised at the bilateral level.
Yes, sir. Absolutely. Absolutely.
So I completely agree with you. And this is my, well considered opinion that the good offices of the two countries at the level of what we call of, SARC, because it has always been the contention of India, even about, SARC, that regional issues should not be raised at the SARC level. Rather, the, within the, SARC organization, government of India strengthens the argument in favor of bilateralism. So if the visa problem is there between Pakistan and India, then I am of the view that both the, sides must interact on this particular, issue. And I hope I am very positive, and one should stay always very positive. If this issue is raised at the highest level among both the, nation states in the SARC, region, then definitely I see a very, very swift resolution of this kind of a, impasse. So that is my understanding.
Sure, sir. Thank you for the response.
Yeah. Thank you, ma'am. Now, I have deliberated a lot on this particular, aspect. But it is equally important, my dear friends, that we must, try to understand. Or rather, let me put it like this, that as a student of international human rights law, how in my personal capacity I perceive this relationship between climate and humanity or human rights, then my dear friends, I am of the view the relationship between human rights and humanity is of existential, inalienable, and immemorial character, which rests in the fine balance of human geography and fossilized in the nethermost crux, I should say, or the nethermost gist of the human existence. As a student of international human rights law, I perceive this relationship between human rights and climate change as a rainbow of transcendental nature, whereby desires, dreams, delicacies, and traits, travails, travesties, and the frailties and feelings of life are being guided to maintain the oscillation of climate. Therefore, I can further, elaborate my line of argument, my dear friends. Any attempt, inadvertent or deliberate, which might have been, directed to make any change that is pejorative, pernicious, and prone to decadence in the fine balance of human ecology is not acceptable and must not be allowed to be accepted. Therefore, my dear friends, climate change is the new nemesis, a criminal catalyst and devious, determinant that is cool and cataclysmic both at the same time. The causes of climate change have been natural, asymmetrical, and seismological, which further spawned by the anthropogenic and amorphous actions which are reflected in the industrialization, deforestation, and population explosion at all across the globe. So therefore, it becomes very, very important, dear friends, that we must try to understand this oscillating balance between climate change and what we call, human rights. Human rights, under all circumstances, must constitute a central argument in the entire climate change discourse. Further, development models have, my dear friends, inflicted upon Earth horizontal hazards of crisis, proportions, and it got, divested of its vertical canopy of protection, whereunder nature had been sustaining itself for so long. Therefore, climate change has been impacting the entire reservoir of nature, consisting of what we call of, mountains, forests, oceans, high seas, human health, human development, agriculture, and many more. Whereas, my dear friends, devils of democracy, evils of equality, and lichens of liberty have been presenting over an agenda that is mired in the trajectory of developmentalism that has caused global what we call, desertification, global warming, global glaciers losses, global mass loss of, lives, and dangerous rise of the sea levels and extreme weather conditions. If you take into account, my dear friends, these, causes and the sacrosanct character of this relationship between human rights and climate change, then I feel that this kind of a, understanding, if it is, taken at the legislative stage, at the rule making stage, at the law enactment stage, then definitely and equally people are, sensitized that this human greed and human avarice must also be resurrected and revisited. Then definitely we would be in a better position to appreciate this human rights framework, and human rights framework is going to be very, very successful in addressing the menaces and consequences, negative consequences, adverse impact of climate change. Because global warming and many other important issues has a universal impact. So much so, my dear friends, that it affects Australia at one side and other Gordier Island in Alaska, Paris, Beijing, Delhi, Rio de Janeiro, Lahore, Male, and any other what you call capital city alike. Its effect, my dear friends, concerns human beings as such, not to nationals of a different what you call countries. Everyone is concerned, my dear friends, together with the right to environment, which is progressively developing in domestic and supranational case law and regulation. The claim of humanity to survival is the eventuality or eventually at stake. And what is at stake? It is the human existence. And therefore, it is the collective responsibility, my dear friends. We should try to understand what kind of a consequence we are going to have. I can make an elaboration of the very few ideas for your perusal, and this should be the takeaway of our today's engagement. The idea of a cosmopolitan society is central to individuals and peoples. I am not saying this. Long back in the year, I think in 1795, Immanuel Kant came out with this idea. So we have to revisit our past to understand and to make some kind of a safeguards for the future existence. So idea of a cosmopolitan society centered what we call on individuals and peoples. There is another important idea, my dear friends. Another important jurist, Ulrich Beck, has propounded in 1986, and he came out with this kind of idea, the idea of a risk society. Another important jurist, Anthony Giddens, he also propounded an idea in 1999, if I am not wrong, and he came out with the idea of risk and responsibility that must be taken by the geopolitical entities of the national governments to establish a pro-human rights, what we call approach, a human rights based framework to deal with the menace of climate change. Then there is another important idea that was what we call propounded by Louis Lond, I think in 2014, a very latest what we call contribution. Whenever you find time, you try to visit these very ideas, and he came out with the idea of the globalized human relationships. You may also call it the universal community. You may also put it like this, as I generally perceive it, as the global citizenship. So these ideas must be taken into consideration to strengthen the international human rights law framework to deal with the situation, to deal with the problems emanated or created by the climate change. If human rights framework is given primacy in the entire prioritization exercise of the nation states, my dear friends, then definitely I see some kind of a what we call solace, some kind of a solution of the problems of what we call or created by the climate change, because climate change amplifies existing social, environmental, economic, political, and lot of what we call stresses by the ancillary what we call factors, and creates new ones. Climate change should be perceived as a multiplier of problems. It is having a multiplier effect, my dear friends, and that is bound to push some of the world's poorest and most vulnerable people deeper into the poverty, while strains on nationals and international governance are amplified and progress on developments is also equally obstructed. So therefore, what is important is that a human rights based approach should be central in the entire schematization of the climate change issues. And therefore, it becomes necessary, my dear friends, to understand that a large proportion of the planet's what we call, population already lives in conditions where they are denied many basic fundamental human rights and civil liberties and fundamental human freedoms. So, in such a situation, what kind of projection we have been witnessing of climate change? The projection of the climate change, my dear friends, in the current research, in its current what we call form, indicate that this will increase as a food and water what we call security going to decline. Homes are damaged, destroyed, decimated to the ground by extreme weather events and weather conditions, and more lives are threatened. So in such a situation, what is important, because ultimately whatever climate change is doing, whatever may be the impacts of the climate change, the ultimate reality remains there, and that is the death and destruction and the violations of the rights of the people. So responsibility lies with the governments, agencies, stakeholders, and other important organizations to restore the primacy of human existence in the entire what we call development exercise, or entire wherewithal which is at the disposal of the state. It must be used for the utilization for the welfare of the people at large. Low-lying coastal developing countries and small island what we call developing states, which is popularly known as the SIDS, are likely to be most what we call acutely affected by declining environmental conditions associated with climate change, despite the fact, my dear friends, most have contributed the least through their greenhouse gas emissions. If you take into account the South Asian what we call context, in the context of South Asia, particularly in the context of Bangladesh, Maldives, and Sri Lanka, are off-cited examples of countries in this what we call position. Widely recognized as the most vulnerable countries to climate change because of their high exposures to the negative impacts of climate change and their pre-existing socio-economic vulnerabilities. So in such a situation, what has to be there and what should be expected from these nation states? So it is the responsibility of the highly industrialized nation states that they should what we call take appropriate measures. They must have some kind of a real check. A reality check should be conducted. Who is responsible and what kind of obligations which have been contemplated under international climate law? And one of the most important instruments of international climate law, one of the most important subject matter of the international climate law is UNFCCC of 1992 and other important COPs mandates, including the latest COP mandate of the COPs 2022, and it was COPs 27. So my dear friends, there are certain specific human rights which generally get affected by the climate change: right to life, the right to self-determination, as I have already told you, right to development, right to food, right to water, and right to health, right to housing, right to education, right to meaningful and informed what we call participation in the state-sponsored activities, right of those most affected by climate change, what are their rights, and the rights of what we call the most important rights that comes to my mind, and that is the rights of the future generations. So human rights protection under international human rights law constitute a very, very important what we call understandings. You have already studied the rest of the what we call articles, because when we were deliberating the generations of human rights or other important what we call particularly at the first generation, second generation, and third generations of human rights, all these generations of rights must be on our fingertips. But in the context of climate change, there are certain important specific articles which must be understood in understanding that these are the rights which are going to be adversely affected by the menace of climate change. Suppose I can give you an example of Article 6 of ICCPR, UN Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. In this particular article, the life and its dignity, right to life, right to human dignity, right to certain important incidental, connected, vicarious notions of what we call of dignity happens to be at stake. Again, I can give you another important article, again Article 6 of the Convention on the Rights of Child of 1989, that also takes into account this idea of what we call of nuances of life. Another important what we call article that I take, suppose you can take the example of right to food, because the food has become the biggest what we call casualty because of climate change. If you try to understand Article 25 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, my dear friends, then it is exclusively devoted to right to food. Again, I can cite certain important articles from the second generations of human rights, and it is basically the UN Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights Convention of 1966. Then Article 11 becomes very, very important. Again, it is taking into consideration this particular right. It is not the question of right to food alone. It is a question of right to adequate food. And this must be emphasized. That is the beauty of these articles. Article 11, then the CRC, the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Child, Article 24 subclause C, that also makes a case for this particular understanding. So how we have been what we call visiting these specific what we call articles. Disabilities Convention, Article 25, Article 28, again what we call third convention, I mean the UN Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. This convention takes into account Article 5. So that is also taking into considerations when we are talking of these articles. And at the same time, my dear friends, we should not forget Article 3 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Then there is, after food, there is another important right to water. Then again we are having certain important what we call rights in different what we call conventions. Different articles are there. Every core international human rights treaty is offering something on these aspects. So these aspects must also be taken care of, and definitely I intend to share these specific articles with all of you for your perusal, for your consideration, how we are going to what we call understand this whole idea of climate change and human rights, what is the relationship, and how we are going to attend some of the important what we call aspects. After water, there is a question relating to what we call health. So there are certain specific articles relating to art. Then there is a question of the right to housing. Whatever the rights I have enumerated for your perusal, my dear friends, on each and every aspect, these rights and their existence has been affected, decimated, destroyed, and there is every apprehension that the climate change in its current form, if no remedial measures are undertaken, is bound to decimate these rights. And there are adequate provisions, adequate arrangements which have been made, and these rights and protection against them have been what we call incorporated in these 9 core international human rights treaties. And it should be the mandate to govern, to regulate, to attend, to address, to respond to climate change within the framework of international human rights law. And that is the relationship between these two important what we call narratives. So thank you very much for the day. I will definitely attend to you personally as well as online, and the rest of the what we call rest of the formalities I would definitely intend to share before the crystallization in the next engagement. So thank you very much for being with me, and with all possibilities, my dear friends, I intend to, and I have always been in favor of organizing and conducting and holding classes offline, but because of the situation on the campus, because of the reluctance of some of the stakeholders, so it was basically out of compulsion that we are meeting online. So, but only one student is there, and that is was Miss Wasif Rasool, who is attending classes online. So we should, I understand his, anguish or her anguish, as well as her, worries. So very soon, I hope, I'm very optimistic that inshallah very soon, everything would be hunky-dory at all fronts. So thank you very much. Any questions?
Thank you, sir. No questions. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye. Take care.
Thank you, sir.
You're welcome. Thank you.
জয় বাংলা, জয় বঙ্গবন্ধু।